So our next look into the various historical topics about British Columbia will be the actual focus on the history of Vancouver and how it emerged as a prominent city, not just in Canada or the Pacific Rim, but for the overall global economy, and not only to various social movements, because the actual slogan for Vancouver is "By sea, land, and air we prosper." So let's get started. Now, some basic kind of overview, interesting information about Vancouver, the city or the metro area of Vancouver, is that it is a major coastal seaport. It is, in fact, the most important seaport in Canada, second only to perhaps the St. Lawrence River, which was transformed into a sea wave as a great mega project back during the Cold War. It was also a host of the 2010 Olympic and Paralympic Games. It is the third largest city in Vancouver, being that, also being in Canada. And as around 2020, it's around 2.5 million people. But it's also been a place for thousands of years for meeting, trade, and settlement. So once again, we should start looking at the first peoples for the history for now Vancouver. The very high level of cultural complexity existed in the area of Vancouver because of the immense amount of different types of food throughout all four seasons could be found here. And also there was winter villages that would be comprised of large plank houses that could be made out of western red cedar. There was also the first people's special gathering called potlatches. But for the city of Vancouver, too, it does fall within the traditional territory of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Stalo. Now, the potlatch was a very special ceremony. It was a festive ceremony that was practiced only by the Northwest Coast First Peoples. However, potlatch can also be done by the High Dutch, Nututla, Kwakiwakwak, and the various other Coast Salish peoples. But the main purpose of the potlatch was to redistribute wealth. It was a collection of singing, dancing, sometimes even using of masks of various animals or deities for it, whereas the celebrations of births, rites of passages, weddings, funerals, or even honoring the deceased were reasons to have a potlatch. It was a very special ceremony and aspect to their culture. And along with the singing and dancing, it could have, of course, spiritual ceremonies, theatrics, dance, music, and a feast. But for the potlatch, the most sacred ceremonies were usually done during the winter time. This is a photo of a Kwakiwakwak potlatch that was done in defiance of the Indian Act sometime in the 1890s. This is a longhouse found at the UBC Anthropology Museum. Now, with this in the peoples, one I'd like to highlight is the Squamish. And the actual word means people of the sacred water. For the Squamish, their traditional territory covered from Indian Arm through the House Sound, and their history, stories, and law were passed down by word of mouth. They lived in villages and communal houses made of cedar planks and poles. They traveled via dugout cedar canoes, and their main source was fishing, hunting, and trapping for it. This is an example of a traditional seagoing canoe by the Squamish in Burrard Inlet. In the background, you're looking at North Vancouver with the possible steam of Lonsdale in the background today, where the sea bus goes to. Another people are the Musqueam. The Musqueam are the only people whose traditional territory falls within the boundaries of the city of Vancouver. The rest are within the metro area. And even though their traditional language is extinct, unfortunately because of the Indian Act, work is underway to rebuild a new version of it. And they are known to be the oldest residents of the area of Vancouver because archaeological evidence has found house debris and shells that goes back quite a few thousands of years. And it is also known that the Hudson Bay explorer Simon Fraser was probably the first European to come in contact with these people, but contact was rather hostile. This map shows the traditional territory of the Musqueam. And the third and final one I'd like to highlight are the Stallo. The Stallo's territory is in the Fraser Valley, and it's believed, came to our land around 8 to 10,000 years ago. And while they were highly mobile hunter and gatherer people, they did not ever come in contact with the explorer Captain George Vancouver. And that's probably because the Fraser River was too shallow for Vancouver ships to go through. And unfortunately, it's believed that for the Stallo, their first contact with Europeans was actually not face-to-face contact, it was because of smallpox. But that being said, they were vital trading partners with the Hudson Bay Company Fort Langley. They also have a lot of different mythologies, like the raven and the clamshell for the first man. But speaking about Vancouver, the Spanish Captain Jose Maria Navarre was the first to explore the Strait of Georgia in 1791. Captain George Vancouver met the Spanish expedition de Alianza Galiano and Galiano Fellows del Foyer. They met off of Point Grey, and they continued to explore the Strait of Georgia, while Vancouver explored Puget Sound, which is nowadays Seattle. But George Vancouver was the first to touch ground in nowadays Point Grey, even though Simon Fraser was the first European to reach the area overland via the Fraser River in 1808. Think about the disputed territory from the previous notes. Now, Captain George Vancouver was an officer in the British Royal Navy, and he was most famous for the 1791 to 1795 expedition. Some other things about Vancouver, too, was that he circumnavigated around the world. He landed on 5 continents. His expedition had 4 ships, a crew of 153, but only 6 people ever made it back to Britain. So while he has some navigational legacy and mapping legacy, his expedition definitely has a lot of controversy around it. But the actual growth of settlement did not begin because of the Fraser Gold Rush. In fact, actually, the Fraser Gold Rush did very little to get actual settlement happening, other than New Westminster, which was for a short period of time the first provincial capital. Settlement did not begin until the 1860s due to the power of the resistance of the Squamish chiefs had to any sort of European-style settlement in the area. But the very first non-native settlement in Vancouver was McCleary's Farm in 1862. These are some images of what the first settlement had looked like, and the actual farmhouse. Early on, lumbering was the main source of industry in Broad Inlet, and it was done by Scandinavian people. The first sawmill began operating in 1863 in Moodyville, which is nowadays Lonsdale, which is the Seabus terminal. And this was chosen because of the large trees. And in fact, actually, these trees were really large and strong here, which allowed the British to create a type of sailing ship called windjammers. And windjammers is kind of what the name implies. These are really, really large sailing vessels. And only here in this portion of British Columbia had the trees strong enough to be turned into masts for these massive sailing vessels. And so the actual development of the windjammer would be a catalyst for early growth in the area of Vancouver. What would be another catalyst was John Gessie Jack Dayton. Dayton set up a small 24 by 12 foot saloon on the beach about 1 mile to 1.6 kilometers west of the sawmill in 1867. It was a very popular place. He was known to be quite the talker or gassy, and so a number of men who were basically working at the saloon would set up their quote-unquote settlement around Gastown because that's where they would go after work, which resulted in 1870 the colonial government to send a surveyor team to British Columbia and kind of survey out the very first official town site. But the actual town site wasn't called Vancouver, it was in fact called Granville. But Gastown was a new town site that was situated on a natural deep harbor. So because of the fact that Gastown was on naturally deep water that basically never froze over, the Canadian Pacific Railway decided to make this their terminus on the mainland, which also fulfilled the commitment for British Columbia to join Confederation. In fact, the railway president, William Van Horn, decided that Granville was not a good name. It was too seedy. And so he suggested that instead of calling it Granville, it should be renamed as Vancouver, as people in Toronto and Montreal knew where Vancouver Island was, but had no idea about Granville. And so with this new name, the city of Vancouver was incorporated on the 6th of April, 1886. But basically, like most things, towns, especially in British Columbia, it burned down on the June 13th there. The famous landmark, the Gastown steam clock, and the very first railway. Because of the fire, the first train to Vancouver was delayed by 1 year, so the actual service began in 1887 on May there. And on that year, Vancouver, the city, had a population of about 5,000. By 1892, 15,000. By 1900, 100,000. Today in 2020, about 2.5 million. So it actually has an area that has a rather fast population growth. So example, pictures of the importance of the early history of the railway in this area. And the Canadian Pacific Railway also had ships, steamships that would take people across the ocean. This is the museum, the Britannia Mines Museum, which was the biggest copper mine in the British Empire, just south of Squamish. And Vancouver at the beginning of the 20th century really started to happen after the Panama Canal was opened in 1914. It allowed Vancouver to compete with major international ports. It became an alternative route to get goods to Europe. It allowed the wheat from the Canadian prairies to be shipped overseas and not to eastern ports. And so in 1923, the federal government spent money and made a commission to make the Port of Vancouver a very technologically advanced port for the British Empire. This is what Cordova Street looked like with the late stages of the Industrial Revolution with tram cars and lights. Another, of course, really popular market or location is the Granville Island, a territory that actually is owned by the Canadian Pacific Railway, but has become a very iconic part of the Vancouver city scene. And to wrap up a few other things about the city history, in 1986 it hosted the World Expo Fair, which was a fair that lasted for 6 months. It showcased and focused on new transportation technologies, especially SkyTrain. But there was massive disputes with organized labor for it, but it definitely had some very iconic buildings that were built, such as SkyTrain, BC Place, and Vancouver Trade Convention Center. Other than Cypress in the bottom right corner, Canada Place, BC Place, and SkyTrain were iconic landmarks that were built because of Expo 86 in the World Fair. Another major event that Vancouver has been the host state for was the 2010 Winter Olympics, where there was 82 countries. The 2010 had the largest volunteer force of any Olympics, included Paralympics. It showcased the unknown kind of like national spirit. Many new buildings were built, and emphasized the importance of First Peoples, also known as the four host First Nations. And these were some of the landmarks built: the Richmond Oval, the new Convention Center, Sea Sky Highway, and the Canada Line SkyTrain out to Richmond and the airport. Fort. And just because it's a nice picture, the Raven's Nest at Grouse Mountain, a very popular tourist spot, or the Caddo Valley Railway Trestle, and the Boardman Bridge.